Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion called FAWCO for CEDAW, where we will be discussing the importance of the Human Rights Treaty, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This power-packed program should give you everything you need to know about CEDAW as an important policy tool. And joining us are two experts, Dr. Gail James and Elahe Amani, who have spent decades bringing this high-level treaty to communities in the United States and globally. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are really looking forward to the discussions. Since the introduction of the Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000, gender equality has become mainstream, becoming its own Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 5, Gender Equality. Now, what this has done, making gender equality a sustainable development goal, is put it front and center in many global policy decisions. And this is also where the importance of CEDAW is further emphasized. Now, before I invite our honored panelists to discuss their experiences with CEDAW, I would like to take a few minutes to give you some important background information and an overview of the terminology for this important international treaty. We do realize that some of you may not be as familiar with CEDAW's history and provisions, so we hope that the overview will give you exactly what you need to participate in the panel. CEDAW is an acronym meaning the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So it was an international treaty adopted in 1979 by the UN General Assembly, and it has been described as an international Bill of Rights for women. It was instituted on September 3rd, 1981, and has been joined since by 189 member states of the United Nations, with the exception of the United States, which we will get to a little bit further in this program. So CEDAW contains 30 articles and provisions which define the meaning of discrimination against women and also establishes a means for state parties to make changes to ensure gender equality. And we'll go over some of these. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so CEDAW outlines basic fundamental human rights for women in terms of political participation, economic participation, education or access to education, reproductive health, civil rights, and access to opportunities in society. All of these are fundamental areas of living a quality life in a society, in a well-functioning society that women have to have access to or have to have the ability to participate in, and CEDAW ensures that for us. We can go to the next slide. So there's three principles of CEDAW. The first is substantive equality. They want to create equality for women and men, or those who identify as women as well, if we broaden that definition. It also outlines non-discrimination. How do we reduce the amount of discrimination in society against women? And establishes a state obligation. If we're talking about CEDAW at the state level or at the UN level, CEDAW has also been adopted for the city level and now also the company level, which we'll get into a little bit further in this program. But it does outline this important state obligation to pay attention to the equality of women in society. Okay, next slide. So what I want everyone to understand quickly is there's two important definitions of equality embodied in CEDAW. The first one is de jure equality, and this defines situations that are legally recognized. So some member states of the UN have had laws historically on their books that were discriminatory towards women or either eliminated or severely limited their participation in different areas of society, like land ownership in Uganda, for example, or women's access to having a bank account in many countries in the Middle East region. There's also de facto equality, and these are situations that are not legally recognized, but that exist in society. These can be social conventions and mores, anything that isn't necessarily a law on the books, but is still a mechanism discriminating women or removing women from equal participation. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So there's three terms that I want to make sure that I clarify before we get into the program with our panelists, because you will hear these terms thrown out quite a bit. And the first is signatory, then ratification and accession. And these are terms that have to do with a treaty. Of course, this could easily be a 20-minute slide, but I'm just going to give you very quickly what this means. So
When a member state is signatory to CEDAW, which the US has signed CEDAW, President Carter has signed it, then it's basically saying that it does not establish a consent to be bound officially by the treaty as of yet, but it's establishing a will to participate within the treaty's guidelines. The second one is ratification, and that's where a state indicates its consent to be bound by a treaty and where it is officially accepting the terms of CEDAW and the agreement and the reports that it will have to make and the changes it will have to make within society as well. And then the third term is accession, which we probably won't talk about too much tonight, but it has a similar legal effect to ratification, and it's where the state accepts an offer or opportunity to become party to the treaty. Okay, we can move on to the next slide, I think. So I put some success examples together in this slide deck, which is actually from the Companies for CEDAW framework. And of course, I won't go over all of these, but I just want to point out that there are many critics of CEDAW. Many would say CEDAW is inefficient. It's too high level, it's too broad. And I would beg to differ with those critics because Uganda, for example, has funded programs significantly, which I have seen actively at the UN, to reduce domestic violence and even establish a domestic violence database, the very first ever in the country. Cambodia created its women's ministry. Austria, we sat there with FAWCO last year in our regional meeting, listening to all of the progressive things that Austria has done around SDG 5 and particularly around maternity protection and paternity leave within the country. So, of course, you can read through those examples later. We've put a resource guide together with you, which we'll introduce later in the program. We can move to the next slide, and you can go through all of those and enjoy them, actually. So I mentioned earlier that the United States is one of only a handful of countries that has actually not ratified CEDAW. And as I mentioned, that difference between having signed and officially ratifying the convention. And President Carter signed CEDAW all the way back in 1980. But unfortunately, it has sat waiting for Senate confirmation. According to the US Constitution, that is a requirement for official ratification. And this has not happened in clearly decades. So initially, when CEDAW was launched, the support from our executive office was there, but it just hasn't quite made it the full step of the way. And we have some remedies for that you'll hear about in a moment. Okay, we're good to move to the next slide. So how has CEDAW been adapted in the US? It was created for countries, adapted for municipalities with the Cities for CEDAW initiative that Elahe and Gail are going to be talking about extensively in a moment. And a most recent framework that I was able to adapt in 2020 called CEDAW for Companies that creates a framework for the treaty to be used within private sector organizations and nonprofits as well. Okay, we are good to move to the next slide. So this is just a logo of Cities for CEDAW. We can advance. Some pictures of some success stories of Cities for CEDAW, which Elahe and Gail will talk about in a moment. Okay. And there's a CEDAW report card that goes along with this process where any city agreeing to be bound by CEDAW also produces annual reports that are public that shows their progress. So this one's from British Columbia, British Columbia. I wanted to put this on here as an example so we can advance. And then there's CEDAW for Companies now as well. So, and then we can go on to the final slide. Now, the reason this panel was assembled is, as many of you may have heard of this decision, some of you are calling in today from different European countries, but there was a case in the United States over the summer called Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. And this case concerned the constitutionality of a 2018 Mississippi state law that banned most abortion operations after the first 15 weeks of pregnancy. So Jackson Women's Health Organization was Mississippi's only abortion clinic, and they sued the state health officer in March 2018. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and recently, by decisions of the Supreme Court justices, has now overturned two precedent cases, one of them being Roe versus Wade that many of you have probably heard about. And what this basically says is that now the Constitution of the United States does not confer a right to an abortion for a woman, and many of you, this is reproductive freedom, which is the context of what we're talking about. So Now we can focus on our speakers today. We have two very distinguished speakers who have done for decades work on CEDAW, and I'm very thrilled as I have had the pleasure of launching the Cities for CEDAW campaign initially back in 2013 with both of them and with Women's Intercultural Network. The first I want to introduce is Dr. Gail James. She has had a career in facility and administration as a dean and vice president of academic affairs, including a Fulbright scholarship in India, a National Defense Education Fellowship, and a postgraduate study at the Kennedy School of Government. She retired as Director of Learning, Communities, and Academic Achievement Center at the University of Kansas, and has served on boards of directors of Women's Intercultural Network, the Kansas City Women's Political Caucus, the Women's Foundation, the Alliance Française, United Nations Association, Women's Equality Coalition, and Dr. James was recently inducted into the Women's Political Hall of Fame, as if her other accomplishments weren't enough. And so we also have, after Gail, we've got Elahe Amani, who has such an extensive bio. I'm not even sure we have enough time for your bio, Elahe, because you've done so much over the years. But Elahe is a gender, peace, and human rights activist. She served in the California State University system for the last 31 years as a director of student and academic technology services, a lecturer in the Women's Studies program, and a deputy director for Title IX. Elahe has followed the global women's movement since 1985 during the third UN Women Conference in Nairobi, Kenya. She also attended the fourth UN Women's Conference in 1995 in Beijing, which brought us what many of you are familiar with, the Beijing Platform for Action. She presented a paper at that conference, the post-Beijing conference in Cuba, and all of the Commission on the Status of Women sessions since 1995 in New York. So you could say Elahe is very qualified to be on this panel. She also presented at the UN Human Rights Council's 20th session with a briefing on stoning practices. So in 2003, as Women's Intercultural Network's board member, she went to Afghanistan as a trained mediator and played a pivotal role in bringing the women's NGOs in Kabul to the same table for coalition building and collaboration. Elahe has been working with Mediators Beyond Borders and the faculty of the International Training Institute and cross-cultural specialist of Mediators Beyond Borders, and was the chair of the inaugural Training Institute of Mediators Beyond Borders, Women in Mediation, for women leaders in the Middle East and Turkey. Currently, she is the president and chair of Women's Intercultural Network and one of the founders of the Iranian Circle of Women's Intercultural Network, or ICWIN, as it's called. More recently, she was elected to the National Association of Community Mediation's board and is a well-published writer, both in English and in Persian, on a variety of issues, some of which are Women News Network, Open Democracy, and Truth Out. So she's also very active in the Iranian community and active for the rights of Iranian women worldwide. We also have Ms. Pam Perrault, who has been the UN representative for the Federation of the American Women's Club Overseas, FAWCO, as is our name, in New York and Geneva since 1998. She is a member of the NGO Committee on the Status of Women in New York, the vice president of the Zonta Club of Houston, and a UN chair for Zonta District 10, and a board member for the United Nations Association in Houston. She is a certified international human resource professional and is a graduate of Connecticut College, where she received a master's degree in business administration from the University of Minnesota. So welcome to all of our panelists this evening. We're very grateful that you could join us. And I want to kick this off, continuing the last part of the presentation on the Dobbs case with Gail. So Gail, again, thanks for being here. Your experience and input is so valued this evening and much needed at a time like this. So I want to ask you the first question that I have, which is particularly about a very important historical moment in the US following the Dobbs case. So I want to discuss the Vote No campaign in Kansas, as it was the first major vote in the United States to reflect the post-Roe reality, and it dealt with a proposed amendment to the state constitution in an attempt to contain the Kansas Supreme Court's support for abortion rights. So can you tell us about the coalition formed for this campaign? How were you able to bring bipartisan voters together in support of reproductive freedom and privacy? And we also want to know, what were your biggest hurdles and how your Cities for CEDAW experience helped you?
This is a huge question. I'm so pleased to be able to tell people about it because everyone is surprised by the results, even our internal organization here in Kansas, because the basic are three things. One is timing, is we knew it was coming, so there was time to plan. And what that meant was that instead of doing the traditional organizing, four major organizations came together, which is ACLU of Kansas, Planned Parenthood of Great Plains, which is Kansas and Oklahoma, and Trust Women, which was a well-established Wichita-based clinic, very much like NARAL, which does service as well as advocacy. And fourthly, a student organization called URGE, Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equality, based at the University of Kansas and other campuses. So this 2 years prior, they had a chance to coalesce and plan and strategize. Secondly, I think the most significant reason for the success of this campaign was going back to basics. And we have to remember that we know how to do coalition building, we know how to organize and canvass, et cetera. But they really focused, their strategy focused on two elements of advocacy, which is what you do for candidates, which is you phone bank, you go door to door, canvass, and you make sure voters are registered. You do all of those basic steps. But what this group did was start early and gathered 1 million volunteers. It's astounding when you consider what it took to do. So they did tens of thousands of door knocks and et cetera. And I think they did over 1 million phone calls and maybe many more because of the population here. And then most importantly, they took on a strategy of what you do when you have issues. So working for candidates is one thing, campaigning on issues is another. And so what they did was invest, they raised money and invested in information, mailers, targeting seniors, for example, of why should they come out and vote for this issue, men, and they formed a very broad coalition. Don't forget that, and this is applicable to CEDAW globally, Cities for CEDAW nationally here, that human rights advocacy is really about local issues, how you are treated in your job, in your neighborhood, in your schools. And so this is how we organize for CEDAW, and this is what the message was here in Kansas on the ground. Grassroots, this will affect you. This is the main target of the opposition, is to prevent you from having adequate health care. And so this message resonated, I think, very much. Also, I think one, I'm saving the best for last, which is that their strategy of this coalition was to target not just those already on the pro side, or to vote no for choice and health for women, but also those who were conservative and who were unaffiliated, not registered to vote as either Democrat or Republican. So what this meant was they targeted what your rights are as a citizen, and that it's up to you to safeguard those rights. And that if you want the government to, and we use partly that messaging of, if you want them to tell you what must happen with your body, you know that this is not what you want. And so it was very interestingly orchestrated to target unaffiliated voters as well as conservatives who leaned toward reasonableness. And so that's what worked. It really did. I know all the principals, I worked with them for many years. And so I would ask, I would like you to go, I want the 1-2 punch. I want to see you advocate even more strongly of how racist this is and how anti-woman this is. And they decided, no, they were not going to do it that way. They were going to say, in a lofty global vision of what is human rights for women and what is healthcare for women. And in addition, they stayed on the ground. And this is what our mentor and founder, Marilyn Fowler, has always said. We work on the ground. We take a global vision and we bring it to the grassroots. And so that's how the campaign succeeded. The polls were very close, all up to the primary, but in reality, it was 60-40, which is basically an outstanding landslide in favor of human rights. And I would add, as you go on to the other topics, is that the CEDAW Treaty, in its preface, in its preamble, says very distinctly, women's role in procreation should not be a source of discrimination. And that says it all, really, because that's how we link up CEDAW and vote no for choice and women's health.
That's beautifully said.
For choice that was against this amendment to change that, excuse me.
That's beautifully said. And I think given the polarization in the US right now, the political polarization, the fact that so many people mobilized for this in a bipartisan way is, I mean, breathtaking and inspiring, and is a breath of fresh air for the country, I think, and gives us a lot of hope in the direction forward. So thank you for sharing that experience, Gail. And I know that this was not your first rodeo in Kansas, and nor was it in also Kansas City as well.
Right.
You've been instrumental in Kansas City at widening CEDAW's influence. How did you go about starting your Cities for CEDAW initiative there? Because I know that came before. And what was the timeline for introducing your local ordinance? Did you have particular allies? And also, we also want to hear what your biggest hurdles were, because there always are hurdles, right?
Yeah. There always are, and otherwise it would all be in place. Yes, I think this was the advantage, as you know, as you were involved at the grassroots, at the initial stages with Wynn and Marilyn Fowler, that the United Nations, having passed the CEDAW Treaty, we had trouble getting it ratified. And so with Marilyn Fowler, Soon Young, and June Zeitler from the Leadership Coalition of Civil Rights in Washington, we call it the three-leg stool, launched the Cities for CEDAW. We will bypass the Senate. We will go local. We would see if local cities will adopt either a resolution or an ordinance. And so this was launched in 2014. We all attended, and we can talk about, Elahe was there and you were there, we can talk about it further, but basically I would say we brought that back to Kansas City, our delegation that had been at the Commission for the Status of Women Forum. And within a few months, our city council, which had maybe 4 or 5 women, adopted it and put a resolution together. By 2015, we had a resolution that the mayor at the time took to the US Conference of Mayors in San Francisco 2015 and signed on, with hundreds of US mayors signed on to that, which was really quite remarkable as a resolution. And as you know, resolutions are statements of support and endorsement. They are not legally binding. So since 2015, we have been working on an ordinance, and we want a CEDAW ordinance because it is a legal binding format for bringing human rights into public policy. And this is where CEDAW and the reproductive rights ally, that human rights are not a global entity only, they are grassroots, they must be tied to public policy, which is why we want treaties signed and ratified, we want ordinances, and we want a local mechanism for enforcement and monitoring. And so that's how CEDAW began. So my local initiative in Kansas City, Missouri, which is a fairly a good-sized city in the Midwest, we have been working with city council since then. It has taken us 7 years. We just had it endorsed by the newest mayor, and now we have a majority on the City Council of Women who endorsed it. We have now a Gender Equity Commission, which is what we have asked for many years, and therefore a set of principles to monitor over time. The first element is a gender analysis, which we can talk about in a moment. But it took that much time. And I will tell you why it takes time is because there's a great deal. I'll start with the hurdles first, and then I'll go into our achievements. The hurdles are a lack of understanding of what human rights into public policy really means, how it can be written in the legal staff of city government. It has to take a long time. We've seen that in San Diego recently. The legal department really has to work over this language and conceptual framework. Also, there's a great deal of resistance to the United Nations in conservative circles that presents sovereignty issues for those who believe in states' rights, which is a conservative principle that against federalism and sovereignty of a collective voice for human rights. And thirdly, I would say the hurdles include the constant change in local government. So you can be supported by your mayor and city council, but in 2 or 4 years they're replaced or may be replaced. And so this has a lack of continuity for an initiative. But I will come back to the most significant challenges, successes to counteracting these challenges, which is coalition building. And this, again, relating to my first remarks, is you go back to basics. How do you move any particular issue forward in a public sector? Well, you have to build your coalition first. The first steps, and FAWCO is a perfect example, that you federate, you bring multiple voices to the table, you work through what you want to support. And we have had such great success with all of your FAWCO organizations on a local level. Zonta, AAUW, now, and business and professional women, many nonprofits and local organizations come together, and we represent then a collective voice, and we speak in advocacy for our issues. That has been one of the abiding successes for us. And in a political sector, you also have the political forces that pull against that. And so one of the founders of the Cities for CEDAW initiative in the founding city, which is San Francisco, that is, we give great honor to Krishanti Demaraj, who is at the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers University, has said, you do not take no for an answer, you persist, we continue, we do not stop and look back, we go forward, we must move forward. That bring human rights to a grassroots initiative is hard work, but the persistence really matters. So I would say those 3 elements: persistence, coalition building, and staying true to your principles. In other words, sometimes you're offered a compromise, and what we want to do is evaluate that compromise carefully, because sometimes it's giving a bone and not giving you the full drumstick to be nourished by. So if they don't offer funding, if they don't offer support in terms of a commission, then we have to say, no, we'll hold out for that. So that's what we've done. We also have the final word I would say to that is, we have success now because we have a Vote No, which was a successful campaign. We also now have in Kansas City a local endorsement and an ordinance for women's gender equity. But we know that this is only the beginning. The forces are still gathering on, they're not even on the horizon. They're at our gates still. And there's still abiding disaffection, disinformation, and misinformation in terms of the United Nations and human rights initiatives. So I think that is the remaining issue that we're still dealing with.
Gail, thank you. That is such a comprehensive overview of a process like that for anyone in this session today who might be thinking about involving in a Cities for CEDAW or launching if they're based in the US. As much as I'd like to say most European countries have already ratified CEDAW, but that does not mean that local action isn't needed on that level. So it's not just because your member state did, there are other levels and involvement of CEDAW, and Gail, you've given us a great overview of that. Thank you. Thank you so much. So we're going to go to Elahe now, because there is a topic that is in the news a lot these days, and it is representing one of the timeless struggles of women in Iran. And this is really a historic moment for their basic human rights, with protests erupting globally in support of them, women cutting off their hair, burning their clothes in support of the women in Iran. And Elahe, you are a tireless advocate for women in Iran. You have been part of the Women's Intercultural Network for over a decade now and have followed a similar approach to the NGO itself, which Gail mentioned, of course, bringing the global to the local, which is also what is called for in the Beijing Platform for Action, I must add. But your activism, Elahe, focuses on women in your local community and in Iran, and connecting not only the Iranian women in your community with women back in Iran, but also women outside of that cultural framework to understand how to help these women. And she's also active in making women in her community advance as well. So Elahe, how do you make the connections between the global and the local, and what can we do for women in Iran now? How important is it to ensure CEDAW's success at the local, national, and global levels in light of a huge human rights struggle like this?
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for invitation. Two important questions. What's going on in Iran? What is this feminist revolution happening in Iran? And also the CEDAW question. So I first give you thoughts about what's happening in Iran. The demonstration ignited by the police killing of Mahsa Amini have entered its fifth week in Iran and in diaspora. As we heard in the news, on September 16, the police arrested and beat to death a 22-year-old Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, on the street of Tehran for her improper hijab. She was wearing hijab, but her hijab, according to the morality police, was improper because it was not covering all her hairs. The anti-government protests and civil unrest started hours after her death at the hospital in Tehran, intensified, spread to all 31 provinces, and within days reached at least 83 cities in Iran. Although more than 100 today, actually, yes, 350 people have been killed, and thousands of Gen Z, Generation Z, and Alpha, younger women and men have been arrested. The protest among the young and old continues. So Iran, I have to mention that Iran had multiple eruptions of protests in the last 43 years. Many of them fueled by desperation over economic difficulties. However, the new wave of protests led by women and girls of Islamic Republic, the generation that were born and raised in Iran during Islamic Republic, the issue of compulsory hijab. And I have to mention, Iran is the only Muslim majority society that has compulsory veil and punishment for not adhering to those laws. The compulsory veil or hijab is symbolic of the control, censorship, and oppression of Iranian people. At the core, this is not any individual person's fate. This is about human rights of Iranian people, with women and girls leading at the forefront of this struggle, and some people, academics and advocates on gender equality, call it a feminist revolution. So as Jessica mentioned, women and girls burning their scarves, cutting their hairs in powerful display of defiance. Political bodies of the generations born and raised in the last 43 years are now revolting against the law, depriving them of their choice, security, and fundamental economic, social, and political rights. So, and of course, in response to these massive waves of protest, unfortunately, we don't hear the full scope of them in Western countries' media. And there are some reasoning behind it that is being reflected in the media and social media about that. Also, the Iranian, the 6 million Iranian in diaspora is giving full support to the struggle of women in Iran. I myself, between my life being busy with advocating for gender equality, family, and other women's intercultural network and other responsibilities, been attending many protests in Los Angeles. The last one in LA last weekend, estimated by police of Los Angeles, 30,000 people. Similar protests for those of you who are living in Europe, in Berlin on 22nd, brought 80,000 Iranian European to Berlin. So it's a huge, huge demand for accountability by Iranian people inside Iran and in diaspora for Islamic Republic to basically let go of the power they are holding for 43 years. So this is some thoughts about Iran. But talking about CEDAW, as Jessica mentioned, 6 countries that she mentioned, including Iran and United States. And I always mention that 4 of these countries are so small. I mean, not Somalia, Sudan, but Tonga and Paul. They're so small islands that in Caribbean that if you're flying over those islands, you won't even see them because they're so small. So basically, the 2 major countries not ratifying CEDAW are Iran and United States. So given the rarity, a sequence of questions come to mind. Why have these states not ratified CEDAW? What does it say about the rights of women within these countries? And furthermore, what does it say about these countries' commitment to human rights in general when they ratify treaties protecting some groups, but not those protecting women? These are some questions that often people ask us, and we should raise when a country refuses and respond to it when a country refuses to ratify a human rights treaty, especially when the treaty ensures protection for around half of the population. So I have to mention that the United States is the only country that have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of Child also. So that is, that's also many Americans don't know neither about CEDAW nor the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So how should we understand these states' unwillingness to ratify CEDAW? One way, I think, of looking at the treaty commitment is by identifying these countries' cases within the category of non-ratification, which are the most different really from each other, comparing how countries score for the political rights they guarantee to their women is both highly relevant and highly revealing of how a state views women's rights in general, which we call CEDAW, the Bill of Rights of Women and Girls. On the issue of women's political rights, I have to mention Iran and United States represent vastly different positions in their action and in their public discourse. Yet rather surprisingly, both states refuse to ratify CEDAW. Iran has the lowest and the United States has the highest women's political rights score of the country which have not ratified CEDAW. So that's an interesting point. The United States is a vocal champion of human rights and a harsh critic of Iranian regime. Iran, in turn, is a critic of what it sees as the ideologically Western and imperializing conception of human rights put forth by United States. So regardless of these completely different perspectives, both now share this case study, the same issue that both in terms of their decision not to ratify CEDAW and the Bill of Rights for Women and Girls. So, in a research done by Olivia Wittenberg, she concluded why Iran and United States, these two opposing countries with two different perspectives on gender issues, are not ratifying CEDAW. Quote, in the case of Iran, the CEDAW is not consistent with Islamic law, which I agree, because Iran's constitution is based on Sharia law. In addition to disagreement over perceived Western perspectives of women's equality. So, and in the case of United States, concerns over sovereignty cost pertaining to the women's reproductive rights, as well as a strong tendency to invoke democratic exceptionalism, have kept United States from ratifying CEDAW, in addition to other issues that that both Jessica and Gail touched on it. So I also have to mention that at the height of reformist movement, Iranian parliament passed a bill to implement CEDAW in May of 2003. However, it was not ratified by Guardian Council, Khamenei, since it was deemed opposed to Islamic teaching. Thank you.
Thank you, Elahe. That gives us a much deeper perspective into two of the very few member states that have yet to ratify CEDAW. And to your point, the differences are quite stark and opposing in many ways. And this is quite fascinating, and we will come back to this point a little bit later in the discussion. I want to take it from the global level for this next question to the local level, because you were also a key part of the initial launch of Cities for CEDAW with Women's Intercultural Network. You were at the table in all of these meetings, and your local network also took this initiative to get a resolution passed in Long Beach, California. So for others joining us today who may be interested in doing the same, again, I'll ask you the same thing I asked Gail. What challenges did you face in passing a local resolution in Long Beach? And what was your timing, key steps, allies, and biggest hurdles? Because we know those are there. So we want to know what they are.
Absolutely. So in Long Beach, I think it was our narrative, our story is that Iran Women's Intercultural Network, as we all know, have different circles. We have circle with women in Afghanistan, Uganda, Japan. And so a group of Iranian women came to me and said, why not a circle with Iranian women? And I said, I'd never like to beat my own drum, as I was on the board of Women's Intercultural Network. And I said, sure. So back in 2015, I think, Jessica, you were at that gathering in San Francisco, yes, that Iranian Circle of Women's Intercultural Network was formed. And we are basically in Southern California, the 25 women activists who formed the circle. So, so of course, since Cities for CEDAW is one of the campaigns of Women's Intercultural Network, some of the women, including my own sister in Long Beach, they said, why not we push for ratification, for having an ordinance on CEDAW, having a resolution on CEDAW, or hopefully an ordinance on CEDAW. So we followed the guideline that was provided by leaders of Women's Intercultural Network, Cities for CEDAW, what it was reflected on the website. And my sister, she's a brilliant engineer, but she also didn't know about CEDAW. But she took it on herself to study CEDAW and learn more about it. And one of the city council that was serving in city of Long Beach City Council was Iranian American woman. So we reached out to her because we knew her, and we said we wanna pursue this goal of having Long Beach being a CEDAW city. And she didn't know. She's an attorney serving on City Council of Long Beach, but she didn't know about CEDAW. She didn't know United States has not ratified CEDAW. So we had to educate her. And it took us probably 2 years to provide information, to meet with her. I met with her. So she agreed that in 2016, she put together a resolution, and the City Council of Long Beach in 2016, on March 8th, they passed this resolution. And so we were very happy. Our allies, not in the process of educating the city council person, which is Susie Price, that's her name, but prior to taking it to city council officially, we contacted all other women organization representative in Long Beach. So we built a coalition, and on the day that city council passed that, we had representation of NOW, we had representation of League of Women Voters and other organizations that they had an office in Long Beach. So it was a collective work, and they assigned a city analysis to California State University of Long Beach. And they also estimated a cost of $218,000 for the gender analysis, which I felt it was not realistic. We had conversation about it, but I think that putting the city manager, putting that price tag on that became a barrier to really pushing it forward. I also have to mention that, so we're still in the process of ordinance. I made several presentations to Human Relations Commission of Long Beach, and it is formally on the path of preparing for an ordinance for City of Long Beach. I also have to mention that in May of 2019, LA County, which Long Beach is the second largest city in LA County, among 88 cities in LA County, Long Beach is the second after Los Angeles. So LA County also have done some human relation of LA County, have done some work on CEDAW. And so if LA County embrace CEDAW, then Long Beach is also will be a cities of CEDAW. And this is another aspect of what's happening in California, because really CEDAW is on fire in California. We had San Diego County having an ordinance for CEDAW, which is a huge thing. San Diego County is huge in Southern California. So not only cities, but counties for CEDAW is also another path that kind of lead us to have more cities implementing the principle of CEDAW as a human rights for women.
Thank you, Elahe. That's a very broad overview of that, and an excellent idea to anyone local, particularly in the US, that might want to start in a local ordinance themselves. And I think both you and Gail have given us a lot of information about what to expect. A term both of you mentioned is coalition building, and I want to stress that enough. Is like you gave the example of FAWCO being a coalition, a mass coalition of other women's coalitions, and this seems to be one of the key drivers and instrumental in passing something like this. So before we go into the Q&A, There is an important question that I wanted to ask that loops back to why we started this panel in the first place. And that goes back to the Dobbs case that I gave an overview of earlier for those on the call, again, not familiar with that case. So, and this question is for both Elahe and Gail. So I want to turn the spotlight onto both of you now for this. In June, the Supreme Court ruling in the case Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, as I mentioned earlier, overturned the longstanding constitutional right to abortion for American women. And it also eliminated federal standards on abortion access that had been established by these earlier decisions. So going forward, for those on the call not familiar with what this has done in the US, is that it will be up to each state now to establish laws protecting or restricting abortion in the absence of a federal standard now, hence what Gail was describing about Kansas. So what many view this as in the US is a rollback of reproductive privacy and freedom for American women. So, and I'll let, I guess, Gail start because Elahe was just presenting. So Gail, this question for you first. What does CEDAW state regarding reproductive privacy and freedom? You did touch on this earlier. And how can a local or state level ordinance help women in those respective states?
I think we often assume that the CEDAW treaty talks about abortion, which it does not.
Good point. Yes.
As I mentioned in the that its preamble, which is very key, you know, women's role in procreation should not be a source of discrimination. And therefore, that's a premise, a foundational principle of the CEDAW treaty. And in many aspects of its articles, Article 7, Article 5, Article 12, I believe, I don't have that list in front of me, but they support SRHR, sexual and reproductive health rights, all the way through the document, all the way through the treaty, and all the way through its outlining what states can do, member states, individuals can do. And so we take our key from that. And what that implies is support for women's health across the board, understanding the role of girls in a society and their rights, and raising the floor for their education and their empowerment. So health, empowerment of girls, and thirdly, and most importantly, how states impede women's rights and well-being. And so that's how CEDAW addresses this issue. They talk about reproductive health, family health, and well-being. And they also, the CEDAW treaty also emphasizes the role of men in supporting women's equality. So gender equity is really built on the equality of males and females. So it addresses, the treaty addresses it in that way. I would also add the most significant element is to look at what the CEDAW Commission actually does. As you know, the CEDAW is based in Geneva, under the Human Rights Commission at the Geneva installation of the United Nations. And so that commission meets regularly. States are required to submit reports. And the commission, we have also presented, I should say, Sun Young and Marilyn Fowler led a delegation to Geneva to report on what cities for CEDAW were doing. They were thrilled. You could see the smiles on the commissioners' faces, these ministers of their nations. It was wonderful, and we'll go again shortly. But what the CEDAW Commission also does is when there is a transgression or an issue that needs to be looked at, the commission will undertake its research and constitute a process. And in each case, in the most significant cases, and there are many articles written about this that you can find or I can send you. One was a young woman in Chile, another was Peru, and I think a third in Malaysia, where a woman or girl was denied access to reproductive health, to an abortion, and their health was endangered, and one of them died. And so the state they were being sued at the United Nations level of the CEDAW Commission. And so they ruled in favor of these girls and women, and that women and girls have right to abortion because it's part of their human rights, because their health and survival is often at risk. And so we look at their findings then to say, this is what CEDAW supports. If the language does not state in the treaty, CEDAW recognizes the right to abortion. It does not, as I say, it does not state that, but its actions indicate that that's where the support will go, to women's rights about their health and their body and their role in society. And so this is why we make the alliance between any human rights initiative on behalf of women and the specifics of the CEDAW Treaty, and also the human rights, choice rights, abortion rights in the United States. And so they coalesce. But as you know, even the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, has its detractors and has been also delayed in the ratification process as well as in the courts. And so this is where we are at a standstill, because the forces of opposition are formidable. We have the faith base, we have the political ideology base, and we also have the indecision and lack of information of the population in general. So the workload is a heavy lift, but we persist. But the CEDAW Treaty is very clear in its support for women's rights and women's autonomy and empowerment.
That's excellent, Gail. And I might add too, many of the harsh critics of CEDAW within the US claim that it advocates for women to have abortions, to just go out and have them. And that's false. That's, yes, to your point, is not what it advocates. And we do want to clear the air on that today. What Hillary Clinton has defined this as in a former debate when in the 2016 election, is she said that this is defined as in accordance with a woman's faith, in the privacy of her family, be that her husband or immediate family. And the third part of that is under the care of a licensed medical provider. So I think that gives a bit of a broader perspective on what the power of CEDAW. So I want to turn that same question over to you, Elahe, as well. If you need me to repeat the question, feel free to ask. No,
that's okay. That's okay. I remember the question. Yeah, I think although Gail mentioned that abortion is not stated in CEDAW, in the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, but the spirit of CEDAW is inclusive of the woman's right to their body, and abortion and reproductive rights, and abortion is under that category. So yes, it's not mentioned, but it's the spirit of CEDAW is inclusive, in my opinion, of abortion and reproductive rights. But in California specifically, I have to mention California is committed to upholding and expanding protections that ensures reproductive health care and as a right and not a privilege. The legislative package, which signed just not long ago on September 27, 2022, strengthens the budget actions taken by government earlier this summer to protect and expand reproductive care in California, while also breaking down the barriers that have caused historic inequities in access to the health outcomes of our most vulnerable communities. You know, California is host to many first-generation immigrant people and some refugees. So these actions that California built just in September, I just quickly mentioned that, allocating more than $200 million to help pay for travel costs, cover uninsured care, support healthcare facilities, and provides security for people who are seeking abortion, signed legislation to help protect patients and providers in California from civil liability for providing, aiding, and receiving abortion care in the state. I have to mention, after living in Long Beach, California for many decades, just in the last few years, I have seen a few cases of few people standing against abortion rights. So it's something that we need to be very vigilant, even in California. And also California launched a multi-state commitment to defend access to reproductive health care and protect patients and providers. And also the governor of California signed an executive order preventing medical records, patient data. These are coming to what you issued, what you mentioned, Jessica, about privacy.
Yes.
Medical records, patients' data, and other information from being shared by a state agency in response to inquiries or investigation brought by other states or individual within those states looking to restrict abortion access and declining the right of any person in California that lawfully seeking abortion. So because we are, this last part of this executive order is to protect the right and privacy of people who will be traveling to California from other states for abortion. So we felt it's very important part of this, of what we have in California, that we protect the privacy of even those who come to California for abortion.
You do bring up an amazing point about the privacy issue. I had recently submitted a paper to the University of Exeter, had a journal on surveillance, and I had written this extensive paper about how women, it's called Tracking Jane Roe. I can provide a link to it later, but it does outline how these women seeking abortions in many states are now being tracked through advertising tools that you use every day when you go on Facebook or a social media site. And so while that's a whole separate panel in and of itself and does warrant a lot more discussion, I do want to, in light of timing, open the floor up to questions from any of our attendees first, who may have listened to our program so far and have questions for Gail or Elahe. Do we have anyone? It's hard for me to see in particular because I'm toggling between screens here.
Well, this is Alexandra. We did have pre-submitted questions. And
Yes.
So the first one was, how can I be involved in a vacation area in mid-Missouri? So I believe Dr. James kind of mentioned that was her hometown or home state.
I would say my home is on the East Coast. I'm a New Jersey, New York person. I live in the Midwest, however, and so I would say the best thing you can do is just Google Missouri and Missouri tourism, and there are tremendous vacation places, very back to nature, as well as enormous cultural institutions, and I would say that's where you can begin.
No constitutional bans on vacation, though, I must add. or
right. Although they do say that our fellow and sister organizations say it is very difficult to be driving while Black in Missouri. It's a very difficult conservative state in that way, especially in those vacation areas in the southern part of the state. So just to let you know.
Yes, the next question is, how do I find out if our local city is active? I just want to mention that I put in the chat a link of how you can be engaged with the City for CEDAW campaign. So for instance, Missouri does have some ordinance in place when it comes to City with CEDAW. So check out the link that's in the chat. But do the panelists have any other suggestions for how to act locally?
Yes, I think you can access any one of the member organizations that you're all familiar with, whether it's League of Women Voters, Women's Political Caucus, Seroptimus, Zonta, Business and Professional Women. They have their ear to the ground and they have their hand in the on the mechanism of women's rights, so they would know what's going on in the city. Also, and this is what I do frequently when I don't know, I want to target a city like Detroit, for example. We go on the mayor's website, the city website, and scroll through and see what do they have a human rights commission? Do they have a women's gender equity? Are they doing a racial equity? In what capacity might that reside? And it's quite variable around the country. And therefore, there is no consistent one way, one structure, one organization within a city to track it. So you have to do that, your research. But it's not hard to do. It just takes some time.
Okay, and then perhaps Pam, you can take this question. How is CEDAW different from other international human rights treaties?
How is it different? Well, it depends upon what the treaty actually is, because I think one of the things that was mentioned earlier was the fact that we have the Children's Treaty, which has actually been signed by, I think, even more. It is the most signed treaty, I think, of all. And I think that this particular one is one, obviously it relates, there have been other human rights treaties that we have mentioned before on discrimination for disabilities. There have been some obviously on racial issues. There's the child issues. There's treaties on all sorts of things. The fact that this applies to only half of the US population is scary, that it still has taken this long. But I think it has been listed several times that there are several things that go against any treaty now in the United States. And I think Gail mentioned this, Elahe mentioned this, there is a suspicion against any international treaties. Many people are still suspicious of the United Nations. The fact that that the treaty would be reviewed by quote unquote foreigners. I was looking at a site the other day that was talking about the fact they don't like the idea that foreigners might be sitting on a commission, and everything relating to anything which would be enforced by the UN says international government, which again, as Gail mentioned, was a question of sovereignty. So that looms large on every single treaty that comes up now. It is a very big issue, and that's why they've had difficulty getting it out of committee. Any treaty. It has often been said that even though the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, the United States was behind it. Eleanor Roosevelt was pushing for it. They basically said if they had to do it again today, that would probably not pass. And of course, that was really the basis for all human rights laws today. So it is a special treaty. It is different. But again, the forces that are in the United States right now are against almost any kind of treaty. So that works against every single one.
So there's a Pam also represents the U.S. Women's Caucus at the UN. And we hear the word caucus a lot in reference to politics, right? In the US, we all know the Iowa caucus is definitely a timeless term that comes up again and again during election season. So what I want to ask Pam is, for anybody on here who's from Europe, what do we mean by caucus? And also, why are caucuses important? Why is this kind of organization important?
Okay, well, obviously, this is one of these loosely highly political terms. The idea of comparing this to an Iowa caucus, where individual people come together and then do votes, is one special thing. The idea of the U.S. Women's Caucus, for example, is not an original idea per se. It came out of the fact that Europe has the Council of Europe, and that acts as a caucus. There is a North American caucus relating to women, which operates as an advocacy group at the United Nations. The idea for the U.S. Women's Caucus actually came out of one of the founders of WIN, who was Marilyn Fowler, and who was she was a pioneer in many ways. I know Gail knows her, everybody else has known her much. She basically felt that the American women's groups need to get together to have a larger voice. It is a coalition, and it is a caucus of, currently a caucus of those women's groups or groups that are based in the United States or have an interest in the United States that have ECOSOC recognition at the UN to have a larger voice at the United Nations on issues that are global issues, but obviously those specific to the United States. So this started several years ago, and so we're still organizing. We have both individual memberships as well as organizational memberships. Obviously, WIN is one of the founding members. FAWCO was one of the founding members. We came through Lori Richardson's efforts. So we have been working on that, and we are continuing to grow and to try to get a larger voice so that indeed organizations that have interest in getting things like the CEDAW passed, the ERA passed, can get together and bring a collective voice at the United Nations.
That's great, Pam. Thank you. And it's funny because I was asked that question actually by someone in Germany. We keep seeing the term caucus in your materials. What does that mean? Do we have those in Germany? So I did want to clarify that on this call, definitely since you represented. And so I want to also give the ability, does anyone have any questions on the call again? If not, I do have one more for the panelists.
I think we should clear, there's one question from Emily, which is how many cities have joined Cities for CEDAW? So I think that's like a big misconception about what Cities for CEDAW is.
Okay.
Yes, I would say it is a loose structure. It is, I should say it's structured loosely because every city is different, as you know, in your organizations and your places of origin, everything is quite variable, really, so that we have a loosely based federation of cities and now counties in the last couple of years, because every county also has a political structure and its own commission and commissioner to whom we have petitioned for CEDAW ordinances at the county level. As Elahe mentioned, both San Diego and LA County have done that. We have, I would say, about 75 cities and counties affiliated with the Cities for CEDAW initiative. We are shooting for 100, but the number, that's arbitrary, obviously. We have about half of that number have resolutions, and another third of that have ordinances. The ordinance is harder, as we have said, because it's a legal entity, is harder to initiate and move through and get passed. But we have about a third of that number there. And then we have about, I would say, another 30 to 40 cities and counties that are exploring, investigating. Let's say one organization like Zanta or Business and Professional Women begin to say, you know, we want to do something to institute for greater women's safety and well-being. Human rights initiatives will bring the CEDAW initiative. They make presentations to city council, more people sign on. And so that's how we have about 30, 35 cities that are exploring at that level. And they contact us. And our website has materials and toolkits and how to talk to your city council members and other aids that really help people at a grassroots level starting this exploration for CEDAW.
Jessica, can I mention something in the Council of City, which Women's Intercultural Network? We are blessed to have Gail each year putting together a report on Cities for CEDAW. I have to mention that when a county like San Diego with such a huge number of cities, or LA County with 88 cities, they pass CEDAW as an ordinance, then all of a sudden 88 cities or 50 cities added to the Cities for CEDAW because it's inclusive of that. But yet the county for CEDAW is, if we can pass that, that's hugely jumping the number of cities that they have embraced CEDAW principle. So that's another way of looking at it. The other thing is Gail and I have been in conversation with different people in California that why don't we shoot for states with CEDAW? So the idea of Cities for CEDAW has now been kind of expanded to counties and hopefully states for CEDAW, that we have to see how it plays out.
That's wonderful. And in 2020, I was happy to introduce a Companies for CEDAW framework that I had mentioned earlier, which will be provided in a link in the end. But when I was consulting with several Silicon Valley companies, they said, how do we use this in our company? And I thought, my gosh, of course. I mean, what do you mean there isn't a framework to use this? Because it's so malleable and adaptable. So we now have that also for companies, that if anyone knows any organizations wanting to continue testing this and and continue forming this, it's available as well for organizations. So if we don't have any more questions from our attendees, because I definitely want to give the floor to anyone who wants it. I do have one more question for all three, Pam, Elahe, and Gail. And this topic has come up quite a bit when I was researching to put this event together. And that is that in Europe and the US, we're seeing this surge of very far right and far left polarized political movements. And as a journalist covering emerging technologies, I can tell you that a lot of that does have to do with what we're seeing on Facebook and algorithms too. But this is representing a lot of deep-seated issues in societies, and as all of you are aware. And so it's important to emphasize at this point that CEDAW is a bipartisan tool, that women's issues are bipartisan issues, because equality for women is a bipartisan issue. So I want to start with, we'll start with Pam. How can we emphasize this more through our activism, similar to what Gail has done with the Kansas initiative? And what's really missing from the conversation between these two sides to help better unite women with different political views?
Okay, very difficult question. I think actually
It's a tough one. Yeah.
I would take a little bit from what obviously from what both Elahe and Gail have said, is that if you stick to very small issues, it's not good. You need to stick to the loftier issues. You need to stick to, it's a human rights issue. It's something that is so basic that it shouldn't be challenged. And women deserve certain rights. A lot of the publicity is against that women are not good. They're going to have less rights, or that they have too many privileges right now. They're going to lose their privileges. I think you have to go to the basics, which is basically this is a basic right for women to be able to live and not be discriminated against on any basis. It's like racial prejudice. There is no basis for discriminating against a person because of their color of their skin or their religion. And this is one more added to it, which is whatever their sex is, they shouldn't do it either. We're talking about equality, and let's leave it at that level.
Thank you, Pam. And I'll direct the next question to Elahe. What would your response be on that?
Well, I think globally, and I have shared this for many of the presentation, I deeply believe that we are living in a world that women's right is on attack globally by two global patterns. One is the rise of religious extremism, not religion as a faith, individual faith, which is a human rights, respecting that is a human rights, but extremism, that using religion to further political agenda in all countries. And so this is one global pattern that is challenging to women's rights. So we are at a position, I feel, that we need to hold on tight to the rights that we gain. And if opportunities arise, further that, like cities for CEDAW, or protecting that with law or ordinances. The other global patterns, which is against the rights of women and expanding those rights, is the global rise of populist right movements. But in Europe, we are witnessing just recently, Italy, the right-wing politicians won the election. And one of the first things I was reading is they want to limit and restrict abortion rights in Italy. In United States, we know that the Supreme Court and the politics behind taking away the right that women enjoyed for close to 50 years, who are the forces behind it. So we need to be very vigilant at locally and globally. We need to build coalition and because only together we can win this war against women globally and locally.
Thank you, Elahe. And Gail, Kansas has done this and is a shining example of this in many ways. What would your input on that question be?
As both Pam and Elahe were speaking, I was thinking of three things. One, I want to highlight to you, which is the role of Pam and the U.S. Women's Caucus at the UN. It is a new organization, but it's a strong organization, well-grounded. The work they have done in this area is really interesting because let's put aside what they are doing, what we are doing at the UN with the U.S. Women's Caucus at the UN. Is separate, but Susan Lee and Pam Perot are instrumental in doing research and providing white papers. And two of them that they have done have been, I would call to your attention, which is we were wondering, what is it? What is the rise of the right wing? What is happening? Why are women voting this way? What is it? And there was a white paper produced, or a research concluded, that pointed out it's about patriarchy and it's about racism, essentially, and that women still are part of those ideological sectors. They are engaged and supportive of patriarchy and of a racist ideology. So when you subscribe to that, then naturally there are limitations to women's roles because women, so we you know what that means, that therefore patriarchy and racism are at the basis, and we don't see that. So therefore, we have to be mindful of that, and I keep asking why, and what is it behind wanting women to wear veils? What is it wanting women to have circumscribed voting rights or bodily autonomy? And this role of patriarchy is instrumental. Secondly, U.S. Women's Caucus, Susan Lee did a paper for us recently in which she outlined what are the faith initiatives behind women's pro or anti-abortion. And what we concluded, which we already knew, is that all of the major faiths support abortion rights for women and choice for women, except the Catholic Church and Middle Eastern countries and Islam and some evangelical right-wing Protestant groups. So that tells you that most religions, Methodist, Jewish, Presbyterian, all have doctrines that support the women's autonomy in her choice up to a viability. And so that is acceptable, but that is not known. And so therefore, in answer to your question, I would say these two research documents give you a grounding for understanding why this is happening and to be mindful of what that is. And then when you're in public presenting to groups, highlight that, because these are things that is not known, not articulated, not greatly endorsed by even the most activist advocates for women's rights. We just don't talk about it very much. And so I want to highlight that. And then I'll close by saying the other element is to think globally, act locally. You know this, but here's an example. If in your organization, in your city, we can't do human rights, it's too conservative, the forces are aligned against us, we can't do that, well, then do something very tiny. And here's what some cities have done. They go on the eviction policy. Women are being evicted because of domestic violence. And so what we did was work with City Council and the Landlords Association, just in a little element of a legal framework, to say women may not be evicted when they are victims of a violent situation, that is their right to a safe environment. And so this was huge. And it's a very tiny thing, however, but it does give you a step to take when the Human Rights Initiative, the global vision, is hard to implement.
Great.
Thank you, Gail. All great points. And we are right at time with this panel. And I also want to congratulate all of you for being exactly on point and exactly on time. There's that old saying, I don't even know who came up with this, that, oh, women are always late. No, we're not. It's 7:28. We're actually well within the confines of our scheduled time. So congratulations on that. And then I'm going to turn it over to Pam, who will send you all off in grace.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica. And again, thank you, Gail. Thank you, Elahe, for a very interesting program. I think you have shown not only the negative sides, which are the challenges that are all out there, but also the positive sides and some of the things that are coming out. That you've given us really a view from the trenches. And I like Gail's idea of starting also with some small steps that you can make, some baby steps you can make, and even the larger steps you can make. I think what I wanted to do for the last 2 minutes, though, is just to direct your attention to a sheet that we have prepared. I don't know if you can put it up on the screen. Emily, do you have a copy of it you could put up on the screen? Of the links that include a couple of key things. One of the links is first information from the first link is from the United Nations, and it explains exactly what, thank you, for the first on the list shows all the things the United Nations, including the actual text of the CEDAW and explaining exactly what CEDAW is. The second is a link to the FAWCO website, which explains a little bit more of those of you who are not from FAWCO or those of you who are actually in FAWCO, explains exactly what the UN section of FAWCO is doing, what the advocacy stands are, information on all the representatives, and what we've been doing on women's issues. And for those of you who are not involved already, we would love to have more of you involved in that. The next one is Cities for CEDAW. This is probably the most important link. This is one which is sponsored by WIN, the Women's Intercultural Network. It is excellent. Gail mentioned it before. Elahe, of course, is the president of that organization. They sponsor this wonderful website that gives all the details that you need to know on a City for CEDAW. It gives you a detailed tool list and exactly step-by-step how to do it. They give you templates on resolutions. They give you the list of who signed it, who hasn't. They give you examples of every single one that has been passed. It's a wealth of information, has everything on it. It's truly excellent. The next is on companies for CEDAW. Jessica had actually worked on this. If there was any more time left, it would be good to go through some of the things that she's done in that program. If you're interested in bringing it to the country level, I suggest you check out that link. And then lastly is the link to the U.S. Women's Caucus at the United Nations. Gail was nice enough to give a public relations tip on that. Thank you. As I mentioned, and she mentioned that you can become individual members if you are interested in joining the group. So again, I would like to thank everybody who has come today to be part of the program. I thank FAWCO for being the host. I thank Jessica for putting it together. And I hope that we would all take some hope from the information we've given today, particularly from the Iranian women, and we stand with them today. Thank you.